Hi everyone, my name is Rachel. I'm an environmental educator here at the South Fork Natural History Museum, and today my program is entitled People and the Environment. So I will be using a PowerPoint for my presentation today, which I will share with you momentarily. I just ask that everyone keep themselves muted through the duration of the program, just to avoid any background interference, and then I will get to any questions anyone has at the end. If you do have questions during the presentation, please feel free to ask them in the chat box below, and then we can address them later on. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you guys and we will get started. So people and the environment. In this program, we will be exploring different perspectives, knowledge, and history regarding science and land management. We will be exploring how people of different worldviews see and approach the environment, people's relationship with the environment, and the issues we're facing today regarding our planet. So what's happening to our planet? Human-induced climate change and environmental degradation. So we're seeing an overall loss of biodiversity, overconsumption, overdevelopment, pollution, expansive wildfires, particularly right now on the west coast of the United States, an increasing frequency of other natural disasters, as well as warming global temperatures. So people and corporations are major contributors to these issues, and while it is daunting and easy to blame ourselves, people can also positively affect the environment. In addressing perspectives, I will be focusing on the relationship between humans and nature within these two perspectives. So the perspectives we'll be exploring today are first, scientific ecological knowledge, or SEK, which encompasses the Western worldview and mainstream environmentalism. And it is the knowledge derived from scientific practice. The second perspective is traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, which in simplest terms can be described as indigenous ways of knowing. So during my undergraduate career at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in upstate New York, I was fortunate enough to take courses under Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is a well-known biologist, author, and a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. It was in her class where I was first introduced to traditional ecological knowledge while pursuing a degree in conservation biology, and why it's important to integrate multiple perspectives into environmental approaches. While it is gaining recognition, TEK is still largely disregarded and marginalized by the greater scientific community. It is also unknown to many, so it is why I created this program and my desire to use my platform to highlight and support perspectives outside of the Western worldview. But as a non-Indigenous person, I will be directly referencing Indigenous scholars and land defenders during this presentation regarding traditional ecological knowledge. So similarities between the two perspectives. While different perspectives, Western science and traditional ecological knowledge do have similarities. TEK has actually been described as the intellectual twin to science. So in both perspectives, we do see systematic observations of nature. Both yield empirical information of natural phenomena and ecosystem and ecological relationships. Both hold predictive power. Observations of both are interpreted within a cultural context, which is really important to acknowledge. And both are extraordinarily successful in furthering human understanding, manipulation of ecological systems. So new strides and directions in ecosystem management, animal behavior, agroecology, and more have direct parallels with traditional knowledge. But as I said, acknowledgement or understanding is rare in the scientific community. TEK also overlaps significantly with ecology, conservation biology, and sustainable practices. The Western science and perspective. So in the Western worldview, land is viewed as property, commodity, and natural resources, and operates within a market economy. So it favors individualism and centers taking for individual benefit. Western viewpoints are, of course, deeply embedded in our scientific approach. Scientific ecological knowledge is knowledge derived from scientific practice. And as I said, it can also be described as mainstream environmentalism and Western science. Western science is unbiased and detached and prides itself on being value-free. So here nature is viewed as object and it is written tradition. So in this perspective, observations are quantitative and made by a small group of professionals from a wide range of sites. And they generally lack long-term observations. In scientific knowledge, there is a biological hierarchy of species in which humans are viewed as superior above all else, and therefore humans are seen as separate from nature. With this view, we do hear things like, especially right now, that humans are the virus, and if we weren't here, everything would flourish. Traditional ecological knowledge. So the principles of TEK greatly contrast and challenge the belief that humans are entirely detrimental to the planet. By definition, TEK is the knowledge of relationships among humans and non-humans and the physical environment held by peoples in relatively non-technological societies with a direct dependence upon local resources. In this worldview, land is not commodity. It is a gift that belongs to itself. And in a gift economy, things are given without any expectation for return. So unlike SEK, traditional knowledge is inseparable from values and social and spiritual connections. Nature is seen as subject, not object. And for this, there is an ethical, reciprocal, and respectful obligation between humans and the non-human world. In TEK, ecosystem complexities are understood through direct experience. There is an oral tradition and stories and information are passed down through generations. Observations are qualitative and are recorded from a single location over a long period of time. The observers tend to be the resource users themselves and are therefore inextricably linked to their observations. So for example, the success of hunters, gatherers, and fishers depends on the quality and reliability of their observations in their surrounding environment. In TEK, there is no biological hierarchy. So in Indigenous ways of knowing, humans have the least experience as new species on the planet and thus the most to learn. So they can look to other species for teachings. In TEK, humans are inseparable from the non-human world. So these differences are why TEK isn't readily accepted by the scientific world. As I said, scientific knowledge prides itself on being detached from culture, but really, and if we recall the similarities between the two perspectives, everything exists within a cultural context. They may look drastically different, but it's there. And this is a quote that I included from Robin Wall Kimmerer because I really like the analogy here and it's something to think about. Conservation biologists have long recognized that introduced species can pose an impediment to ecological restoration when they replace native species and cause imbalance among members of the community. By analogy, might we also consider the impact that introduced knowledge systems have had on the sustainability and restoration of native North American ecosystems. So the history in seeing humans as separate from nature. When Europeans first came to North America, they were amazed by the plant and animal abundance they saw here. It was much different from Europe, which was already largely developed. And they believed that this was the natural way of the land, and not only did indigenous peoples of the land have no effect on it, but also weren't utilizing it properly. It would be a disservice to discuss traditional knowledge without also acknowledging the suppression of it. So colonization has been a major force in degradation, climate change, and injustice to indigenous peoples. In removing indigenous people from their land and exploiting it for natural resources, implementing federal Indian policy like removal, relocation, assimilation, and numerous other acts and policies, cultures, languages, and traditional knowledge, which is deeply embedded in oral tradition, was lost or suppressed. So this does continue today with the repeated disregard of treaty rights and desecration of sacred sites. In viewing people as separate, we come to see ourselves as having negative impacts on the environment only. Thus, to aid the planet, we must remove people or highly regulate people within a given natural area to keep it pristine or wild. The terms wilderness and pristine refer to natural areas that are untouched by humans. In creating wilderness, we have removed and relocated native peoples from their ancestral lands, and this includes the creation of our national parks. The history as humans being a part of nature. So there's a romanticized view of Indigenous people living harmoniously with nature while having little to no impact on it. But contrary to this belief and the original European colonist beliefs, pre-settlement landscape and species abundance of North America was a direct result of Indigenous management. Native Americans managed land to increase food availability. A major way of doing so was through the application of fire technology. So while Europeans viewed fire as strictly destructive, the Indigenous worldview recognizes the dual nature of all forces, so both creative and destructive. The presence or absence of fire had a strong effect on pre-settlement vegetation. Fire application stimulated resprouting in tree species, altered distribution and abundance of vegetation, reduced pest species, attracted game animals that fed on new sprouts, influenced bison movements, and more. So these different habitats created through burning made a mosaic on the land. These patches ensured food security in a diverse and productive landscape. Indigenous people viewed fire as caregiving and a spiritual responsibility to the land. The mosaic had positive impacts on biodiversity. Indigenous burning differs from wildfires in seasonality, frequency, extent, site, and outcome. So they are not random the way wildfires are. Fire suppression began soon after colonization and has been detrimental to forest health. In fire suppression, prairies and grasslands were lost, open areas were replaced, and biodiversity decreased. This is significantly harmful to species and ecosystems that are fire adapted or relied on habitats created by anthropogenic fire. So here we have the honorable harvest, and it is a relationship based on reciprocity. So when we take from the earth, we give back and we ask permission. So I'm going to share a video for the honorable harvest in which Robin Walkimmer describes it.
If I could choose just a single element of the traditional teachings that we're called to pick up, it would be the teachings of the honorable harvest, which were taught us by the plants, who give us everything that we need. It's a covenant of reciprocity between humans and the living world, a very sophisticated ethical protocol. One of the first steps of the honorable harvest is to understand that the lives that we are taking are the lives of generous beings, of sovereign beings. And in order to accept their gift, we owe them at least our attention. To care for them, we must know what they need. And at the very minimum, we should know their names. And yet, the average American can name over 100 corporate logos and 10 plants. Is it a surprise that we have accepted a political system that grants personhood to corporations and no status at all for wild rice and redwoods? The protocols for the honorable harvest are not really written down, but if they were, it would look something like this. When you get to the woods, you don't just start grabbing everything in sight. We're taught never to take the first plant that you see, and that means you'll never take the last. This is a prescription with inherent conservation value. And then if we encounter another plant, we ask permission. I've always been taught to address that plant, to introduce myself, and tell it what it is that I have come for. If you're going to take a life, you have to be personally accountable for it. I know there are places where if you talk to a plant, they think you are crazy, but in our way, it's just good manners. if you're going to ask, you have to listen for the answer. You can listen in different ways, pragmatically, intuitively. Look around, see whether those plants have enough to share. And if the answer is no, you go home. For we remember that they don't belong to us. And taking without permission is also known as stealing. And the Honorable Harvest counsels that we also take in such a way that does the least harm and in a way that benefits the growth of the plant. Use everything that you take. It's disrespectful of the life that's given to waste it. The next tenet of the Honorable Harvest is to share it with others, human and non. The earth has shared generously with us, so we have to model that behavior in return. And a culture of sharing, we know, is a culture of resilience. Plant gatherers often leave a spiritual gift behind, but it can also be a material gift. Weeding, caretaking, spreading seeds, helping those plants to flourish. We give songs, we give ceremony, we give our respect, we give fertilizer. Every breath that you take is a breath that was made for you by plants. On the water that you drink, whether you're in an urban setting, whether you're on a remote mountaintop, we still are recipients of those gifts. And if we take the time to be grateful, that brings us into that state of humility, of understanding that we are not at the top of a biological hierarchy, that in fact we are the younger brothers of creation.
So there are major benefits to acknowledging and utilizing traditional ecological knowledge in science. So in weaving knowledge, we're counteracting the view of land as solely as commodity. It provides new biological insights. It supports the link between biodiversity and cultural diversity and brings in multicultural perspectives into science. It increases opportunities for productive partnerships between Indigenous peoples and Western scientists, and makes science more inclusive for Native American students and practitioners. So there are institutions like SUNY ESF who are starting to acknowledge TEK, and they created the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. And this includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous professors working together to appropriately weave the two knowledge systems together. The International Union for Conservation of Nature also calls for the recognition and protection of traditional ecological knowledge and has for some time now. There's also a growing utilization of fire by land management organizations in restoration programs. So fire is being seen increasingly as a natural part of the environment by land management programs. So we would also refer to burning as hazard reduction burning or prescribed burns. And as we've said, this can aid the ecosystem in many ways. But using it without acknowledging, crediting, consulting, and supporting TEK in this practice is necessary. Scientists have also begun to more and more consult Indigenous peoples in conservation practices. So globally, Indigenous people make up 4% of the world's population, control about 22% of the land, and support about 80% of the world's biodiversity. In the United States and North America, Indigenous people are stewards of about 4% of the US land, represent some 700 distinct communities, and their land holdings contain more wildlands than all national parks and nature conservancy areas in North America. Other major benefits are that environmentalism is intersectional. It's intersectional with social justice, so it's important to include the cultural context in which problems in the environment occur. Cultural diversity has a positive correlation with biodiversity. And seeing ourselves as a part of nature can help us heal our broken relationship with the planet. In integrating the two perspectives, traditional knowledge is not meant to compete with scientific knowledge, but rather works to extend the scope of science into human interactions with the natural world. To quote Winona LaDuke, who is a well-known Indigenous environmentalist and activist, there is a direct relationship between the loss of cultural diversity and the loss of biodiversity. Wherever Indigenous people still remain, there is also a corresponding enclave of biodiversity. Working to repair relationships and taking accountability. So listening to, supporting, and respecting Indigenous people and tribal sovereignty is conservation and is of great conservation value. We need to appropriately support traditional knowledge without romanticism, use of stereotypes, and appropriation. So Dr. Kimmerer often says that Americans as an immigrant culture need to engage in their own process of becoming Indigenous to place to regain their roles as members of the ecological community without appropriating TEK, but learning from it. So we need to acknowledge Indigenous rights, history, and sovereignty, and support Indigenous leaders and land defenders with the same respect and admiration we do mainstream environmentalists like David Attenborough and Jane Goodall. We cannot utilize TEK without also advocating for cultural protection. TEK needs to be acknowledged exactly as it is and not picked apart through a scientific lens. The original territory and the lands that we occupy on the South Fork of Long Island are that of the Shinnecock and the Montauk. The Montauk people currently do not have federal recognition by the US government and therefore do not have designated reservation land, but they are still here despite lack of government recognition. The Shinnecock are a federally recognized sovereign nation, and they are still fighting for rights to their ancestral lands and their rights to economic development today. So this really is just a brief introduction to these two knowledge systems and TEK specifically. So I wanted to provide some resources for people to continue their education on their own time, and also some resources for supporting the Shinnecock Nation. So there are some great documentaries here to learn more from. The Sacred Land Film Project. Braiding Sweetgrass is an amazing book. Dr. Kimmerer is an amazing writer and a great storyteller, and there's a lot to learn from this book. These are my acknowledgements. I'm really appreciative of all of them. There are great references or resources as well. And that concludes our presentation today. If anybody has any questions later on, please feel free to email me at rspeckenbach@sofo.org. Thank you.